Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Steve Krupinski. I'm the marketing director at Michigan Radio. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday evening. We were talking earlier, I think if we had decided to schedule a discussion about the government shutdown, might have been a little more timely, but you know, that's how things are. Life goes on despite that. Thank you all for coming out. I want to just, before we get started, make you aware of a couple things. Again, can I ask, is anyone here ever been to one of our Issues and Ale discussions before? Okay, we have a couple of you. Thank you very much. We're glad to have you back again. So Issues and Ale is a series that we do all throughout Michigan, discussions designed to engage people in conversations about important issues that are going on in Michigan. And tonight we're obviously going to be talking about the issue of the changing Great Lakes and its impact on not only the fish in the Great Lakes, but people who enjoy and use the lakes in all different manners. I want to start off by thanking the folks here at Marc Ridley's Comedy Castle for hosting us this evening. We have a round of applause for the folks here at Marc Ridley's. Thank you. I also want to thank Consumers Mutual Insurance of Michigan. They are our financial underwriter for our Issues and Ale series, so we appreciate their support. And tonight's event is part of a week-long on-air series that Michigan Radio's Environment Report is doing called In Warm Water, Fish in the Changing Great Lakes. If you haven't heard the reports, you can hear them all this week on Michigan Radio 91.7 FM at 8:50 a.m. and 5:45 each day. You can also go to our website at michiganradio.org and catch any of the reports there or the previous reports that we've already run yesterday and today. And we want to thank the Great Lakes Fishery Trust for their financial support of that on-air series. One other announcement before we get started. You may have noticed some of the Michigan Radio tchotchke over as you came in. Help yourself to any of those. One thing, if you want to stay informed about events that we have coming up in Michigan Radio, not only future Issues and Ale events, but other special appearances that we have by NPR hosts and NPR shows. We would encourage you to sign up for our e-newsletter if you're not already on that list. Once a month, we send you a newsletter letting you know about special programs on Michigan Radio, special events that are coming up. And the big incentive for signing up is that you get advance purchase notice for a lot of tickets and first opportunity to buy tickets for a lot of events. In fact, I don't know if any of you are planning on going next week. On Monday, Radio Lab is coming. Actually, they'll be appearing Monday in Ann Arbor and Tuesday in Detroit. So if you're a fan of Radio Lab, you can still get tickets for those shows. So we encourage you to sign up. I do feel obliged to tell you we do not share your email address with anyone. We strictly use it to send you our monthly newsletter, and it doesn't go any further than that. So let's get started tonight. Our host is Rebecca Williams. Rebecca is a reporter, producer, and the host of Michigan Radio's Environment Report, which you can hear on the station every Tuesday and Thursday at 8:50 a.m. and 5:45 p.m. And the Environment Report is designed to explore the relationship between the natural world and the everyday lives of people, which is obviously one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Rebecca Williams.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's nice to see all of you here. Tonight we'll be, of course, talking about the changing Great Lakes, how it affects fish and people who use the lakes. We do want to hear your questions, and we'll have time for your questions a little bit later on. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my left is Dr. Ed Rutherford. He's a research fishery biologist with NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. He works on invasive species and habitat issues. Tonight, he is here as a private citizen because he does work for the federal government and cannot actually be working right now. He's also worked at the University of Michigan's Institute for Fisheries Research. He has a background in marine science and oceanography and earned his PhD in marine science from the University of Maryland. And then we have Marc Smith. He's the senior policy manager with the National Wildlife Federation. He directs water and wildlife policy out of the Great Lakes office based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Before he had this job, he directed NWF's Public Lands Program in Washington, D.C., and before coming to NWF, he worked on Capitol Hill for 2 members of Congress. He has a history degree with a concentration in political science from West Virginia University, and he has a sporting blog called Great Lakes Outdoors. And then we have Dave Spangler. He's a Coast Guard certified charter boat captain. He's been a charter boat captain for 21 years. He guides trips for walleye and yellow perch on Lake Erie. And he's also on the board of the Lake Erie Charter Boat Association and the president of Lake Erie Waterkeeper. First of all, though, I want to start off with a trivia question for all of you. If you know the answer, raise your hand, and I'll call on you. The first person to get this right gets a prize. It's an Issues and Ale pint glass. All right. On average, how much, by percentage, has ice cover on the Great Lakes declined over the past 40 years? Whoever raises their hand first. 41%. Nope. Yeah, but does that count?
Does that count? 75%.
That's close. All right. Oh, were you first? Okay. All right, congratulations.
What's the correct answer?
71%. All right, well done. Well, first of all, now we'll turn to our panelists. Ed, we'll start with you, and you can pick up your microphone there. How has the climate in the Great Lakes already changed, and over what period of time?
Oh, so climate has changed already, and I'm sure everybody has noticed it. We've already had a lot less ice over the last few years and decades. I think since 1970, there's been about a 70% decline in ice cover over the Great Lakes if you look across all 5 Great Lakes. The temperature has gotten a lot warmer, especially since 1997 when we had, has everybody heard about El Nino and how that affects weather on the West Coast? Well, it actually also affects weather in the Great Lakes too. We're kind of in between 2 big weather systems, and the 1998 was a really hot year. I'm sure those who were fishing remember it. And 2010 were really warm, and since 1997, the temperatures have actually been a lot warmer and increased the amount of evaporation off the lakes, which has helped lead to our lower lake levels. So warmer weather, also longer periods of warm water on the lakes, which means the lakes stratify. There's a lot less mixing in the water, which leads to less productivity in each lake. The seasonality of the rainfall over the Great Lakes has changed. We're starting to get a lot more intense storms in the fall and winter period, or early spring, like we had in Lake Erie in 2011, which led to this really intense blue-green algae bloom. And that's actually pretty consistent with what the projections are for climate change in our area over the next 70 years. We're going to have more precipitation, actually more coming in the wintertime, less ice, more stratification, separation of the surface waters from the bottom waters, and warmer waters in general.
Marc, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I like to fish, and so I've noticed when I fish for lake trout, for example, you might have to go deeper because there's not necessarily, the fish are not in the same places because they're altering given the lake level fluctuations. So we have to change our strategy of how we fish. And I mean, Lake Erie Charter Captain guys can talk more about this, but so we're already going to have to change our strategies of how we fish. And to add on the fact that on the intensity of these storms, the 100-year floods are becoming 5-year floods. These droughts are becoming more intense that it's causing further strain on already a water system that is really a very fragile. I mean, when you look at the Great Lakes, you think that these are very, very vast, and they are, but they are very fragile. And any type of alteration to these lakes can really make the management structure of these things go in a different direction. So, all the things that we're doing to manage the Great Lakes are really thrown out of whack from the altering of intense storms that are unpredictable and they are causing drought systems. So how we adapt to this is really the question that we have to ask ourselves. how much more can our lakes take? They're already being impacted by invasive species and compounded by problems with algal blooms that are depleting the oxygen, starving fish from the nutrients that they need. We have sewage overflows. We also have loss of wetlands that are the buffers for making the water that goes into the lakes clean. So they're already facing a huge amount of stressors. Climate change is really that tipping point that really throws it all out of whack. And if we don't get a handle of it now, we're really facing an even tougher challenge moving forward.
And Dave, you've been out on the lakes, I think you told me 30 years since you or so, and since you were a boy, you've been out on Lake Erie, is that right?
Yes, I've been out more years than I care to mention.
Can you tell me, what have you seen change firsthand in your time out there?
Well, as the guys have mentioned already, we have a lot warmer weather a lot more often. It comes early sometimes. 2 years ago, we were able to fish in March, which it just typically does not happen in the western basin of Lake Erie. Usually it's way too cold. But that year we were out 5 days in a row, and it was between 75 and 80 degrees, and you could actually fish in shirt sleeves. Typically, if you go out there that time of the year, you have snowmobile suits on, if you can get out there. We usually start sometime in April. And the following year, we had a very, very mild start to the winter. So some of us made a personal milestone. We were actually on a boat in Lake Erie fishing every month of the year. And that's unheard of when you go back to the old days. I can remember back in the mid 70s, early 70s, when we would have 2 foot of ice covering the entire western basin. You could drive anything out there, including I've seen airplanes land out there to go fishing. You don't do that anymore. Usually when somebody does that, we hit CNN or something like that because you have a massive rescue out on the lake when the ice breaks loose and goes floating off someplace. So it has made a major change. As Marc mentioned, it's made a change in how we fish, when we fish, and where we fish. The rain events of 2011 were massive. We had 4 major ones in the springtime, and the major rivers that feed into Lake Erie were very, very far out of their banks. And once all that settled down, when you drove a boat down through the lake out there, it was like running through a minefield. Trees and logs and buildings and pieces of buildings and barrels and junk and just stuff everywhere. That's how far back off of the banks the rivers exceeded. And in that process too, they dumped a tremendous amount of phosphorus from runoff out into the lake, and that's what led to the massive bloom of 2011. This year the lake is pretty ugly again, and we'll probably get into more of that here in a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think a lot of us who spend time on the lakes notice or have noticed over time is the water levels, and that's been fluctuating. But my understanding is that water levels, looking into the future, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. Is that fair to say? Can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, and here I would like to shout out my colleagues, Drew Grunwald and Brent Lofgren, who are working on trying to forecast water levels in the Great Lakes. And once the furlough ends, you all can go to the NOAA website and look at the long-term record of water levels on each lake. They've got something called a water level dashboard, and you can actually look at forecasts of water levels in the future. And if you looked at those forecasts, there are 5 different forecasts by 5 different groups of modelers, and they're all different, and that reflects the amount of uncertainty. And from what I understand, it's the problem is getting a good understanding of the amount of evaporation that's going on over the lake and predicting when the precipitation and rainfall is going to come in.
Yeah, I think, and I'm a history major, so I'm not a scientist, but I had to throw that out there. My boss always says you always hire a history major. But having said that, anecdotally, the lakes are on a fluctuation schedule, roughly about a 10-year cycle. They go up and they ebb back down. So that's a naturally occurring thing. But the long-term trend is angling down. And that's how we have to look at climate change, is not just what happened last summer or what happened this summer. Look at the trends that are happening over 10 plus years. And that's how you read into what are the projections. And so For example, when I first met my wife, her grandfather has a house in Holland. The dune and the amount and from the water level to the dune was over almost 150 feet. Then over 10 years, it shrank back up to the water was lapping up on the dune, and then now we're starting to see the water recede again. So that's naturally occurring. But we're seeing still receding waters in our ports in Michigan, where more dredging has to happen to even get the boats in. So we're spending hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars dredging, so fishermen or recreational boaters can get out on the lake because they're stuck. So the trends are fluctuating, but the trend is tending to go down. I think that's the uniform science is telling us it's going down.
Yes, so can I respond to that? It is true that they are going down, and they have gone down the last 10 years. And it's true also that that's a break from the long-term cycle of high water, low water, high water, low water. But the uncertainty comes in predicting for the future. Are we in a just warming period? That we're also going to get more rainfall in the future. So if you have more rainfall, you may have more water in the lake if it's not so warm. So from what I understand, the experts on this subject are still a little bit uncertain, and they're not forecasting as deep a water level drop in the future as what was predicted even 5 years ago.
Dredging was mentioned, and that's a major issue in the western basin of Lake Erie since it's the shallowest. If any of you out there run a dredge or know somebody that does, boy, it's prime time now. You can just about name your spot and price. There's an awful lot of harbors and marinas out there that really need dredging. Some of them are closed because people cannot get into them. The water has come up a little bit, but the main shipping channel coming out of Toledo and running down through Maumee Bay and out into the lake, this year the Corps of Engineers is planning on taking 1.2 million cubic yards out of that channel, which is the most they've ever done. The Toledo Harbor is the one that's dredged more than any of the rest of them in the Great Lakes, and this is even more than what they've ever done before. Unfortunately, they turn around and dump it back in the lake, which is another issue, but it's one of those things where it's got the attention of all the Great Lakes. I know the folks up in Georgian Bay are very upset about lowering levels to the point where they'd like to have somebody put some type of restrictions in the St. Clair River to slow the flow down a little bit, which will only hurt Lake Erie some more. So there's those kind of battles pending out there too to try to maintain some docks and something that's close to the water.
Steve, did you want to show? So we were going to show just sort of this is a trend in ice coverage from 1972 to 2009, and then if you can go to the next one as well. So this is not demonstrating a big jump in ice cover difference. This is just an example of 2003, which was a lot of ice, and of course 2012 was a really warm year, so you can see Lake Superior, what that looked like without ice. And then I have another trivia question. Which of the Great Lakes has the greatest number of different fish species? You can raise your hand if you know the answer. Yes?
Huron?
No? Nope. Somebody.
Michigan.
Yay!
That was my point. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Eventually somebody was going to get it right. So what do these changes that we've talked about mean for fish? And Dave, maybe you can start.
Oh boy, that's a tough one about where to start. Like I said earlier, it has changed our seasons. We've been able to start earlier, fish later, which from our aspect is good. But we've had a lot of other things that have happened along with the weather changing. The massive rain events have contributed to the massive algal blooms in Lake Erie to the degree that it's really causing fish populations to shift and move. And the warmer waters also contribute to that. So it's kind of a combination of things, but a lot of it is weather related. The massive runoffs are probably the biggest issue that we have. Today, the entire western basin is green. It's pretty green in a lot of places. Not as green as it was in 2011, but it's pretty close in some spots out there. It has been that way for 6 or 8 weeks, and it's pretty ugly. It has not moved into beyond the Bass Islands as of yet, but it still has time. When it did this in 2011, we were seeing the massive blooms in the Central Basin well into October. And when I say massive, the algae floats to the surface when we don't have a lot of wind. And it gets so thick that it actually will slow the boat down as you run through it. It looks like you're driving through pea soup. Your wake is green. Everything around you is green. And when it's quiet out and it's on the surface, it smells. So I have a tough time explaining to my customers why we should go fishing in something that looks like this. Over the long term, I think it's going to change our fish populations. Our more desirable fish, the walleye and the perch, will probably diminish a little bit. Part of that is due to warmer water. It brings some other species into play, much more prevalent, especially things like white perch, which to us are a nuisance fish. But it's going to change the population overall too.
Yeah, and I think as I said before, there's so many variables that go into assessing the health of the fish populations in the Great Lakes. There's so many vectors that impact them, from water withdrawals to invasive species, algal blooms, toxic waste, and climate change. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly the exact impact climate change is going to have on in particular species. What we do know is that it's not going to help, and it's going to alter the ecosystem in a way that we're not really sure what and how. You know, one of the things that I think we do know is that things might warm up, which might make things like invasive species find an easier home in the lakes. Asian carp, for example, everyone hears about them coming up from the Mississippi River. They're not a cold water species. They might be more adaptable to a warmer lake. We know that quagga mussels, which is like a distinct cousin of the zebra mussel, which was brought in from the ballast water from the Caspian Sea, was found in Lake Superior, which is the coldest. And so we know that, I think on record, Lake Superior was one of the warmest it was ever recorded last summer. So they're finding invasive species that are popping up partially because of the warming of the temperature. So what we do know is that warming and alterations in where the fish are could potentially put at risk the resiliency of fish to adapt. And so what we're doing by continuing to have impacts to the fish species, we really need to think holistically. What are all the factors that go into this, and how do we adapt? How do we help the fish adapt? Because it is a part of who we are here in the Great Lakes. I'm from the East Coast, but I've totally have adopted this as my new home because, I mean, you go out and you see these inland seas, and it's just amazing. You're blown away. And the fish and the tourism and the economies that are based upon them, it's our way of life. It's part of who we are. And so we need to make sure that we keep this unique resource, and climate change is putting at risk, among other things, to that special place that we call the Great Lakes.
And Ed, we talked a bit about before this about the winners and losers among fish. Can you tell us who the winners would be first, potentially?
Sure. So there are going to be some winners. Some warm water fish are going to love it. So smallmouth bass, largemouth bass are really going to do great. And so those numbers will go up. The cold water species like lake whitefish, lake herring, lake trout will either move north or stay in deeper waters, and their amount of habitat will shrink. Their growth rate will increase, but their amount of available habitat will decrease. And so they're probably going to lose. And then species like walleye are more complicated because, like walleye in Lake Erie, a major place for them to reproduce and grow as small fish is in the western basin of Lake Erie. The larger walleye, as you, I'm sure, know, get out of there about middle of May and go out to the eastern basin where the water is cooler and they can metabolize better and there's more food out there. With a warmer climate, that's going to move those big walleye out there a lot sooner. They're going to stay out there a lot longer. Actually, warm and cold water fish need a long period of cold weather in the wintertime to produce their eggs, to let their eggs develop. Walleye, for example, need water temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit for an extended period during the wintertime to be able to produce as many eggs as they do, and they produce millions of eggs for big female. And if they don't have that, they're not going to produce very many eggs. So they're going to, the walleyes and the yellow perch will probably have fewer numbers of young coming into their population. They're actually going to move further, as you mentioned, away from, so if you're in the western basin of Lake Erie, you're going to need to travel further to go catch them. And then as both fellows mentioned, there are all these other additional factors that enter into it. So hypoxia is a big deal. We're seeing more events of hypoxia in the central basin of Lake Erie, for example, which is directly tied to warmer weather, which favors blue-green algae growth. Under climate change, we're supposed to have lower winds, which will favor blue-green algae. When that algae is not grazed, it settles to the bottom, it stirs up the bacteria, then the bacteria take all the oxygen out of the water. So there's no oxygen in the water in the central basin for the lower layers, and under climate change, that's just going to get worse. And that'll hurt some of the prey fish species, but for a walleye that's sitting out there, and it's like walking into a buffet and your prey can't get away from you. It's smaller habitat. The walleyes who are there and can find their prey are going to do great. But it's complicated. Salmon in Lake Michigan, for example, are predicted to be able to grow and do better once they get into the lake. But where they spawn and rear in the tributaries is going to be a lot worse. So it'll mean if we still want cold water fish, then we're going to have to do more stocking to get them get beyond the sensitive early life stage and out into the colder water of the lakes.
And you had mentioned also that we might consider catching different fish, or maybe we'd stock different kinds of fish.
Yeah, so there are, genetics is a really evolving field, and there are strains of trout and salmon, even walleye, that can handle higher temperatures than the ones that we have now. So if we're interested in still having rainbow trout or steelhead, we can stock one that can handle higher temperatures. We can also shift the effort. We can move away from species that are declining altogether and start targeting bass, or even stock new types of species. The striped bass was, it's a cool water fish that was originally going to be introduced into Lake Michigan to control alewives. The management agencies went with salmon instead, but for climate change, that may have been striped bass may have been a better choice.
What about, you mentioned invasives, Marc, a little bit. What do you think we might see happen? Which invasives might do better than others in warmer water?
Well, I've already mentioned Asian carp. And in Asian carp, there's the big head, there's the silver, there's the black, and the grass carp. All those species of Asian carp will do naturally better within warm water. It doesn't mean they can't do well in cold water. I think there's some science out there that says that they would do just fine, and they're very adaptable and very opportunistic. We're also seeing, round gobies are an invasive species that if you walk on any pier in Michigan on any given day or weekend, you'll see half the fisher people taking round gobies off their lines and throwing them on the docks, and the seagulls just taking them apart. And so that would be a species that would thrive. And then also, I think some of these mussels that are coming in, or that are here, are doing well. But every day we're having ships coming in, bringing in new invaders from across the country in the ballast of these tanks, these ships. So all it takes is one species, and EPA has a list of, I think, the top 50 potential invaders across the world that can make it into to the U.S. waters. That would do just fine under a warming climate and in the Great Lakes. But there's also bacteria that we're finding, and VHS, which is, and I'll probably slaughter this, but viral hemographic septicemia. Is that right?
Almost.
Oh,
Hemorrhagic.
okay, good. But basically,
Yeah.
there we go. It's basically the Ebola for fish. Fish bleed out. It's a bacteria that it's not as prevalent in the last couple of years, but 3 or 4 years ago it was a big deal. We saw a lot of fish kills. It's not too hard to suggest that when you're bringing in ships from across the country from different parts of the world that have warm water, those ballast tanks contain critters, bacteria that can thrive, and the Great Lakes could be a very good home for those. So, and climate change can certainly provide a better suited home for those invasive species.
All right, and we'll get to questions in just a little bit. I have another trivia question for you. What percentage of North America's surface fresh water is contained in the Great Lakes? And this is another within the 5%. Raise your hand. Oh, I did say within 5%, didn't I? 84%. All right, nicely done. So Dave mentioned algal blooms, so I'd like to talk about that next. And you are directly affected by these blooms, and we have an image here. I don't know if, Tony, if you can turn that light down a bit so you can see this better. So this is this year. This was taken last week, and you can see the blue-green algae in the western basin of Lake Erie. And then, Steve, if you can go to the next. This is the worst recent year, 2011. Worst year ever?
Worst ever.
So, Dave, could you start with how you actually had your drinking water? You live in a place where the drinking water was actually shut down. Can you tell me why?
Yeah, this happened September 5th, and I live in a small township in Ottawa County. I live where, well, my front yard is Davis-Besse Nuclear Power Station. My backyard is the lake, for a reference point of where I'm at. So I'm not that far away from here, but it's a drive. Carroll Township only services about 2,000 people, but we got a call about 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and the water treatment plant called and said, pass on the word to everybody that do not drink the water. Simply do not drink it. Don't try to boil it, because boiling concentrates it. And what happened was their water intake is out in the lake. It's about 8 foot deep. And that area had a tremendous bloom going on. And the downside of this blue-green algae, the microcystis, is that it can switch over and go to a toxic form, microcystin. And that's what happened in that area out there. The microcystin level was 3.5 times what World Health Organization says is okay for drinking water, and that's why they put the alert out. So we spent 48 hours not on our water supply. What they were able to do during that time frame, fortunately, between Carroll Township and Ottawa County, they have a plumbing system tying 2 systems together, and we actually were able to get good water from Ottawa County, which comes from a different intake in a different area of the lake. And we were on that for about a little over a week, and then we finally got clearance to go back to our own water. This is the first time that a public water supply has been shut down because of a toxin. And it's a direct result of the amount of microcystis that is out in that lake out there. And there's a lot of questions out there. A lot of science still needs to be learned. When does it go toxic? How does it do it? How long does the toxins last? There's a lot of question marks out there about what goes on. Some people think it stays in the water long after the bloom dies and goes away. Fortunately, in Ohio and in most states, there are no requirements to test for these toxins. But fortunately, the testing was done on a weekly basis by our water treatment facility, and it was just a voluntary thing. Most of the big water treatment facilities along the lake are doing this right now, strictly voluntary to test for this. The city of Toledo is spending $150,000 a month extra for chemicals and treatment to make sure that nothing bad goes through the water system. And just this last week, they asked for the city of Toledo for an additional $1 million to go into the budget for operations of that facility to make sure that the water is okay. If you get something as big as the city of Toledo system, which does not have a backup, I don't know if they make enough bottled water to keep up with everybody. And that's what we did in Ottawa County. They had truckloads of bottled water come in. Not a good thing.
And what are the risks to people from this toxin?
It is a neurotoxin. It goes to the liver primarily, but there's a lot of different things that can happen. It's an unusual effect. It affects different people different ways. It's kind of like the bee stings and certain allergies and stuff, where some people can, tolerate it much more than others. But if you have any kind of a health issue, you definitely want to stay away from it. And the other thing is, if you have cuts or scrapes or open wounds somewhere, you do not want to have that water on your body where those are. It tends to go to immediate infections.
And beaches are closed because of this routinely around where you live, right?
Yes, I think every beach from Maumee Bay State Park on and off and on East Harbor State Park now has the warnings up, do not go in the water.
This is a problem also in Saginaw Bay and Green Bay to a lesser extent, but just so you know, it's not just Lake Erie. Lake Erie does have the biggest problem by far. Now, what about fishing? This is another place where you've been directly impacted by these blooms.
Yeah, that's where I get all the questions, and I'm honest with my folks. I tell them what it is and what's going on, but it makes it tough when you have people out, and almost all of my business and most charter business in Ohio is really people that come from someplace else. They're not Ohioans for the most part, unless they're from Southern Ohio. But we get an awful lot of people from Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, all over the place to come for our great walleye fishing. It is the best walleye fishing in the world by far, and they're used to coming up and having a great time catching a lot of fish. I would say probably 90% of my business is out of state. When they come up, they usually come up for more than one day, because good old Lake Erie gets to blowing around out there, and you can't get out an awful lot sometimes. It gets too rough. So they will come up for 2-3 days at a time, and of course they're renting a hotel room, eating at restaurants, going to tackle stores, doing all kinds of touristy type things. Sometimes they bring their families, Cedar Point, go to the beaches, that kind of stuff. But when you take them out and they see this water, and I had this happen in 2011. I had a crew from southern Indiana and Kentucky, and we were down in Huron, and we went out in the fall, and we ran 25 miles, never got out of the green water. It was smelly, and they distinctly said, we will not come back again during the fall. We may come in the spring. We are not going to come and fish in this again. And they haven't. They have not been back. They were a steady customer for a lot of years. But that's how serious it does get, and I can't really blame them. I don't like to be in it either. I'm on the water an awful lot, and I get exposed to it too. But I hate to have customers look at it and say, well, I'm not going to come back. I was telling the folks earlier, from July on, when I get a call to book a trip, usually the first question used to be, how good is the fishing, or how are the fishing doing? I don't get that anymore. The first question is now, how bad is the algae? I hate to start off with a question like that. The fishing has been pretty decent, but to go out in that it's very, very discouraging.
I understand your charter boat captains such as yourself experience some economic losses because of this, because of fuel. Just
Oh,
having to get out of
definitely. Yeah, our first economic loss is the loss of trips. The one I mentioned, like I say, he has not come back in the fall. So that's one trip that I can't count on. But what we try to do is we try to run away from the green water. And in some cases, that's 25, 30 miles out of your way, and boats are not very good on fuel economy. We burn, you know, a gallon a minute sometimes, depending on what we're doing. But it just goes through an awful lot of fuel, and of course, marine fuel is quite a bit more expensive than on the road fuel. So it takes a big hit on your bottom line, because you're paying so much more just to try to run to some cleaner water.
So one of the things, this is about fish, of course, but somebody asked me recently, I don't fish, so why should I care about what happens to fish in the Great Lakes? How would you respond to that?
Oh boy, I'd be out of a job, and a lot of other folks. Ohio has the largest charter fleet in North America. Trivial fact, I probably should have thrown that out for a trivial question. There'd be a lot of people out of business. And not only the charter boat operators, the bait shops, all of the counties along the lakeshore in Ohio, they contribute 1/3 of Ohio's tourism dollars, 1/3 of it, just for people going up, not necessarily always to fish, but that's a big part of it, but to go to the resorts, you know, Kalahari and Sandusky, Cedar Point, some of the places further down east, go to the beaches, do the Jet Express over to Put-in Bay. All kinds of things going on out there that people would not do anymore. And especially with the fishing, that's the biggest fishery in the Great Lakes. One of the numbers that always gets thrown out is when you look at the Great Lakes and compare them, Lake Erie is pretty small and very shallow. But when you look at it compared to Lake Superior has 50% of the water, 2% of the fish out of all the Great Lakes. Lake Erie is the other way around. It only has 2% of the water, but 50% of the fish. There's more fish caught in Lake Erie than the other 4 put together. So it's a big deal if there's no fish out there.
Yeah, I always say that the fish in the Great Lakes are literally the canaries in the coal mine. If you really want to know the health of the ecosystem, look to the fish. And it's sometimes it can be confusing when places that are not like Lake Erie, where you have algal blooms, sometimes the water is so crystal clear that the immediate reaction is that the Great Lakes are clean. This is so clean. Look how clear, I can see 20 feet down. Well, that's a misnomer. And so in order to really assess what's happening, the best way is to look at the fish. And not only is it is a sign of the health of the system, but it also is a $7 billion industry. Commercial and sport fishery in the Great Lakes is huge. And as Dave was mentioning, it's not just the purchases of fishing license, but it's all the dollars that someone comes into that area and spends that adds up to a huge economic impact that we need to base. I mean, a lot of our economies are based on that. And so, you know, if you don't fish, that's fine, but, you know, think of the impact that it has in your community. We are sitting in a very special place on the planet. If you can see your home state from space, you're living in a pretty cool space. And so, you know, if you don't understand the impact on the fish, it's really hard to make an assumption of how healthy the lakes are, because they're a part of our economy, and they really help. Businesses, for example, need to have a clean, sustainable source of water. So they're one of our biggest allies in helping sustain and protect our Great Lakes. We have a coalition of various nonprofit groups, utilities, and some business groups called the Healing Our Waters Coalition that have one goal, is to protect and restore the Great Lakes. And we have businesses that are a huge part of this effort because they know that they need a clean, sustainable source of water to have their economy. We need to have businesses come into the Great Lakes. For so long that our region was known as the Rust Belt. Well, we should be the Blue Belt. We have the largest source of fresh water in the world. And let's utilize that to our advantage. And so, you know, again, getting back to the question of the fish, it's more than just, do you like to fish, and, you know, that's all good, but it's a part of our economy and a part of our fabric of life that makes us a special place as compared to other places. The other thing too is that if we don't measure the impact of our fish, and that tells us a story, you know, we're living in a very water-rich area. The rest of the world might not be in that situation. And so we're living in a place that is unique. And there's a lot of needs for water out there. And if we don't look to protect our resource here in our own backyard, what makes us left open for potential places across the world or in the United States that would come and say they're not even protecting their own water source? Why can't that they don't deserve to have this water this in their backyard? So again, it's if you don't fish, that's fine, but it really tells a story of how the health of the system is. I mean, we know from the 1960s when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire multiple times, Lake Erie was declared dead. You wouldn't want to go fishing. It was literally just dead. Through the Clean Water Act in Congress, when they actually were working and actually got things done, said enough is enough. Let's get a handle of all this pollution because there's fish that are just dead in Lake Erie. Rivers are catching on fire. There's a great beer called Burning River, right, in Cuyahoga or Cleveland. I mean, so we need to make sure that the fish populations are staying healthy because they're telling us a story.
Those are great answers. I would just add to that fish are also, as he mentioned, keep the ecosystem stable. In the Lake Michigan and other Great Lakes in the 1960s, and I'm old enough to remember going to visit my grandfather or grandmother who lived in Chicago, and they never went to the beach. And the reason was the beach stunk because there were dead fish rolling up on the beach. The middle of the lake was green, and the algae sucked all the oxygen out of the water, and there were fish kills. Alewives littered the beaches in rows. And to correct that problem, they introduced salmon from the West Coast to eat the alewives because there was an overabundance of alewives, which had an effect on lower trophic levels, and it helped clean up the water. So it stabilized the ecosystem. So people talk now about ecosystems in terms of services to people. Economy is one of them. Food is another one. But it's also stabilizing the health of the ecosystem that surrounds them. And the EPA's, for the Great Lakes, the EPA's mantra is, or measurement of how good we're doing is, can we swim in the water, can we drink the water, and can we eat the fish? And here's a trivia question I just thought of.
We have another. Okay.
You're done? You're never done. You're never done. So the question is, how many Great Lakes fish is it safe to eat per month or per week?
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you.
Raise
have-
your hand.
Man, woman, or child.
What?
Yeah,
Man,
man,
woman, or
woman,
child.
yeah.
Well, that's a good answer, but that didn't answer the question. Let's say if you're a man. Yeah.
Want to try again? Okay.
4? I actually don't know the answer to that. But I know the one for a woman who's pregnant. And how many times a month is that?
0.
All right, well, that person over there got the right question first. Yeah.
Who had the answer?
So I guess that speaks to what he said was that fish are a measure of, they're the canary in the coal mine. And nobody was eating walleye out of Lake Erie in the 60s because they were loaded with mercury. And the mercury came from fallout from coal burning plants. And so it's really important to keep track of that.
All right. So do we need to open up for questions? All right. So we have a microphone that Steve can pass around. If you have questions, please just raise your hand, and Steve will bring you the mic. There we go. Over here.
I don't need a mic, thank you.
Okay.
We hear so much about invasive species nowadays, and it seems like it's been a problem, let's say, for 20 years. But ships have been coming here for 100 years with ballots. Why has this become a problem in recent times? Or apparently a problem?
50 years.
So the question is, why have invasive species becoming a problem now when ships have been dumping this ballast water for years?
It would appear to be that, yes.
Well, I guess the quickest answer I know is that the only invasive species we know that are I would clarify as the poster child for a ballast water invader is the zebra mussels. They were brought in from the Caspian Sea, as I mentioned. By the time they showed up on research teams of surveying, the amount of populations there, the scientists said it's basically, whoa, there's such a high population of this, it's game over. It's no longer a prevention strategy, it's management. The EPA didn't even regulate ballast water for many, many years. The Clean Water Act says you have to regulate any pollutant to a water system. Well, we would argue that invasive species are a living pollution. And so it only took a lawsuit to force EPA to issue its first regulation, a permit for ballast water. And Clean Water Act was in the early 70s, a lawsuit in the 90s to regulate ballast water. And here we are fighting every 5 years. EPA issues a permit that's just not sufficient to protect the Great Lakes because the shipping industry claims that there is no technology that will stop invasive species from coming in our tanks to be discharged into the water. I guess the point of the question is, my answer is that, we're not doing enough right now. And if we don't do enough right now, all it takes is one species. And it's not just from ballast water, it's from Asian carp coming up the Mississippi River. It's from potential bait shops having different types of bait that can include Asian carp that look like shiners when they're little. So there's all sorts of vectors for invasive species that come in, but it's always been a problem. I just don't think that there's been enough research and monitoring over these years to really identify what invasive species are out there. Currently, right now, there is no comprehensive monitoring in our lakes to discover new invasive species. No one's going out there looking at it, specifically looking for invasive species comprehensively. And so how do we know if we're not looking for them, we don't know what's out there. The one time that we actually did do monitoring was in Duluth Harbor in 2006. They did a specific targeted sampling and they found 7 new invasive species. We have not done a comprehensive monitoring since. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I think what I'm getting at is that what the protections we have in place now are not enough to protect us from invasive species.
Do you think that zebra mussels have been here for 100 years?
No.
How many years have they been here?
Yeah, since the mid to late 1980s. And so they were first sort of detected in western Lake Erie, like a lot of the other invasive species that came through in ballast water of ships. There were invasive species introduced in the 40s and 50s. Probably the worst invasive species we've ever had is the sea lamprey, which got into the other Great Lakes by coming through a new canal that was dug for shipping around 1910, and it made its way through the rest of Great Lakes, getting into Lake Michigan in the 1940s. The alewife was another one that came in through canals in the 50s, and they feed on the babies of native species, native fishes, and really suppress a lot of our bait fish in Lake Erie, emerald shiner and other ones. But the real boom, as you mentioned, was about 20, 30 years ago, and that was due to the ballast water traffic, the increased shipping traffic from Europe. Fortunately, though, the shipping industry has started to accept regulations about treating their ballast water, and so that vector is actually been shut down a little bit. These other vectors that he mentioned, the aquarium trade, the bait trade, coming up Mississippi River, are actually probably the also internet trade. I had some grad students trading fish on the internet. In fact, the snakehead they were trading. So, there's all sorts of different vectors. You go to Myers and look at the fish tanks. That's how they can get into the system. So.
Yeah, but the biggest explosion came with the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. When they dug they dredged the canal and the river system so they can bring in these salties, what are the ocean-faring ships. Because right now, I think what happened before the Seaway was open, they brought ocean-going ships and they transferred them over to Lakers that only ran within the Great Lakes. But once they opened up the canal system and brought open basically an open door for ships from all across the country bringing in all sorts of species, really we started to see a boom in the increase in invasive species.
When was that?
1952-ish.
The other thing that helped that out too is because the St. Lawrence Seaway is international, our friends to the north in Canada have also applied some very stringent rules on ballast water. So fortunately, there hasn't been much of anything since 2006. Of course, I mean, it's a lot of water over the dam because of what's already out there between the zebra mussels, the quagga mussels, and the round gobies, primarily those three.
If I may, my last question. Concerning the three invasive species, zebra mussels, lampreys, and alewives, are they in all the Great Lakes?
The zebra mussels or quagga mussels are very sparse in Lake Superior, and the reason for that is the water chemistry is not suitable to support their shell growth, and it's also colder environment up there. As the water warms, it's going to be more conducive. There's a cousin to the zebra mussel called the quagga mussel, and actually it's got a bigger siphon tube, and since that got in around 2000, they've really crashed the food web in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan in particular by sucking out all the plant growth out of the water. So if you go to those lakes, those are crystal clear lakes, and actually, as you mentioned, that's not so good because that's the basis of the food web there.
Yeah, I think what he's getting at is the diaporia is a plankton that that the zebra mussels filter out. And what we found is that there was a prescription paper by a lot of the leading Great Lakes scientists, and I think it was in the early 2000s, that were tracking the diaporia declines. And they had graphs that showed the declines in diaporia with increases in zebra mussels. And so because of the increase in zebra mussels and the die-off of diaporia, you're seeing a collapse literally of the food web where the alewives had nothing to eat off the diaporia, and the salmon and lake trout didn't have enough alewives to eat. So literally you were having this food web literally come crashing down. And in some instances in Lake Huron, we're already seeing the salmon population gone way down, not just from diaporia, but also from a lack of nutrients that run off, that naturally occurring nutrients that fish need, that need to get out into the middle of the lake, aren't making it out there because the zebra mussels and quaggas are sucking out the nutrients on the near shore and then spitting it out into become a microcystis, which becomes algal bloom. So what you're seeing is the coasts of our Great Lakes have become overabundance of algal blooms and nutrients in the middle of the lake being starved. And so it's this whole system is being out of whack.
3 days ago, we were on the Asabo, and I was shocked because several years ago and every year since, it's been filled with either zebra or quagga, depending on who takes over. But last time we were out, there were none. We couldn't find any. They were usually sticking on every rock, every stick, but they're gone. Do you know anything about cyclical?
Yeah, in river systems, if you have a really big flood come through, it really knocks a lot of those mussels off. But they can recolonize from the impoundments that are upstream, which are like mini lakes. And as they reproduce again, the larvae of the mussels drift downstream and settle on the rocks and starts it over again. So for those rivers, it's kind of going to be like a boom and bust depending on how wet a year it is and how fast the water's flowing.
What research has been done toward knocking them out? I know there was some sort of a chemical that was very expensive. Has there been any other further research done toward knocking them down?
That's a great question, and I'm not too familiar with it. I know there's some interest in biological control. So gobies are ate these mussels over in Europe, and they came over by accident, but they have cropped down some of the mussels in some of the areas. The other natural control is once these mussels get so abundant that they suck all the plant food out of the water column, then their condition gets worse. They can't reproduce as well, so their numbers come down. People have, I think, looked for this silver bullet approach like they use with the lamprey, but they haven't found it yet.
Anybody else? Yes.
I'm trying to reduce this algae bloom problem here. I mean, watching the satellite maps all summer, it looks like drainage out of southern Ontario, into Lake St. Clair, coming down, running green and mud, and especially in the spring. and it kind of accumulates down there around the Maumee. I don't know if the Maumee is another cause. And first time I ever heard, you just mentioned that the coagula mussels contribute to this bloom by the chemical, by how they extract and what they put back in. Is there any other action taken to try to reduce this problem? I know I can't buy fertilizer with phosphorus in it anymore, but is there anything else going on?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of things going on. I've had a long day. I was in Columbus this morning, so I've been back and forth here with a lot of things going on. The Maumee is definitely one of the major sources of the phosphorus going into Lake Erie, and phosphorus is the issue. The blue-green algae needs just two things: warm water and phosphorus. The more phosphorus we get, the more algae we get. This was the same situation way back when Lake Erie was dead. It was attacked a little bit differently then, because back then it was a point source situation, more from the sewage treatment facilities and that kind of stuff. Today it's more agriculture. It's a whole different ball game. And the real key to it is runoff, and especially in the spring. The spring run, and we talked about it earlier with the weather changes and the massive rain events. The spring months are the critical one, and if we get major rain events in the spring, that washes all the phosphorus out into the lake, and that's what feeds the growth of the algae bloom. What's been going on with the farm communities is there's an awful lot of effort going out there to look at different practices, best management practices, as to how they're applying the nutrients. In a lot of cases, some fields have way too much nitrogen and phosphorus on them. They really don't need to apply it. So they're trying to encourage a program called 4Rs, right rate, right time, right fertilizer, right source type thing. There's a lot of education that goes into it. But the big issue is with the rivers draining so much land that you may not get the word out to everybody, and that's the case now. Part of the monies going out are for education to get to the farm community through the farm bureaus and folks like that. But when you look at the Maumee River, which is the largest watershed in the entire Great Lakes, it covers 4.5 million acres of land, some of which is in Indiana, some in Michigan, and of course Ohio. Excuse me. And what you saw on MODA satellite in Lake St. Clair is coming out of Ontario, the Thames River. And that drains the same kind of farmland as what Northwest Ohio is. So there's just an awful lot of folks involved, and an awful lot of effort has to be put on reducing the amount of nutrients that come off of fields and go downstream and go down into the lake.
Yeah, there's really two problems from the algal blooms. It's from point sources like wastewater treatment plants, like in Detroit, that's causing a portion of the problem. But by and far, the largest source of phosphorus coming off of fields are coming from the farming community. And there have been great stories of the farming community working with us to try to figure out ways to improve the way they apply fertilizer, because it's cheaper. They want to save money as much as possible, but they also want to make sure that they are farming every ounce of their land. And so what you're seeing is, with the price of corn skyrocketing, you have a lot of farmers that are not enrolling in a lot of these conservation programs in the Farm Bill that are basically, the federal government's paying farmers to put their land in easements to basically not farm. And some of those easements are basically wildlife buffers and their conservation reserve enhancement program, wetland reserve enhancement program, basically paying farmers to put wetlands as buffers to prevent runoff. Well, now the price of corn's so high, farmers are plowing up that area and making the rows way up to the edge and further roads away. And there's just more education needs to occur. But right now, farmers are like mom and apple pie. I mean, no one wants to actually take on the farming community, and we need them to be at the table and work with us, because it's a tough nut to crack, and the Farm Bureau in Congress has a huge hold on a lot of members of Congress who have power. And so it's not an easy fix. Even though I'm a duck hunter, I would just say put wetlands up and down the Maumee River as a buffer would be great for ducks and great for the river. It's not that easy, because farmers want to use up every acreage they can possible. And there's still this old cultural aspect of things that You know, a pound is better than a half a pound. You know, it's just, we need to educate better. And there are programs that are doing that, but, you know, Congress can't even pass a farm bill. So there's no funding that will go to these programs that would provide the buffers necessary so we can stop phosphorus running off the land. So until we can get a hold of some of our agriculture practices and reform it and have farmers come to the table and be a part of the solution, we're going to continue to have these problems.
I think maybe you had your hand up first.
Yeah, just about the farm bill. Does the farm bill have some sort of provision for that, the buffers?
Yeah, like I said, there's an alphabet soup of programs. There's a conservation reserve program, a lot of different programs that, quite frankly, are redundant. And so, but the main reason behind these programs is to have good conservation, so you can protect water quality and provide wildlife habitat. And so, you know, the original idea of the farm bill was to provide aid for farmers so they can grow, but it's, you know, growing crops has to go hand in hand with conservation, because farmers are the, you know, in my opinion, are, you know, outside of Native Americans, are the original conservationists. Some can say hunters and anglers are the original conservationists, but I guess the point is that the farm bill provides that federal investment that protects all water quality. I mean, by and large, it's the largest conservation bill in Congress. I mean, it's the largest. I mean, it's all private land that we're working with here. And so, you know, we have a bill in the Senate that our own Senator Stabenow is the chair of the Agriculture Committee in the Senate, shepherded through. It's a really good bill. In the House, it's a mess. I mean, they can't get things straight. So we're not sure what's going to happen, but we do know one thing that's in particular for the Great Lakes that will help reduce algal blooms is there is a new program in the Farm Bill called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program that will actually target key watersheds like the Maumee, the Sandusky, and other places, the Fox River that flows into Green Bay, that have phosphorus problems, and will work with farmers to not just do random acts of conservation, but actually locate around where the problem is coming from and target it and put in conservation programs and focus dollars there so you can actually see reductions and measures of success. Because right now you have farmers that are getting random pots of money to do random things, and it's not comprehensively working towards a solution. So Stabenow and other members of the Senate are trying to fix that. And so if we can only get it passed, you know, it will help. But until we do, we're kind of just literally flapping in the winds.
You had a question right here.
There's a chain link fence in a swamp in Indiana that separates, I believe, the Maumee from the Ohio. I'm not sure on the rivers. Wabash. Why should I have any confidence that's going to keep Asian carp, especially juvenile Asian carp, out of the Maumee, which is supposedly an ideal habitat for them?
Well, it is a chain link fence. I've been there. I've walked the entire fence line. It was quite a major undertaking. It will stop the big fish. Obviously, it will not stop the little guys, and it definitely won't stop the eggs. But there is a fix in the works, and it's going to come very, very quickly. I was in Milwaukee for the Howe conference here a couple weeks ago. I had a personal conversation with John Goss, who's the duly elected carp czar by President Obama. And there's a project underway over there. They actually have the drawings and everything completed already to physically separate that floodplain. The problem in the place is called Eagle Marsh. It's north of Fort Wayne by just a little bit. And there is a potential during like a 100-year flood, which happened in 2011, where the waters of the Wabash and the waters of the Maumee actually come together. The Wabash River does have Asian carp in it. They're about 70 miles away from that site. That's the reason the fence was put up. It was put up very quickly. It was a very difficult job. The Indiana DNR put it up. It was quite an engineering undertaking just to put it up, just because of the restrictions they had in this marsh trying to protect the plants and everything in that marsh. But yes, it is a chain link fence. It was plenty tall enough they weren't going to jump over it, but the little guys could go through it. This dike now will completely separate that. It's supposed to handle a 1,000-year flood. They have to buy up, I think, 6 properties. And the biggest issue involved there was when they first looked at that, everyone was concerned about the city of Fort Wayne because it would flood if they didn't do this diking properly. And the drawings have been completed to the point where they're very confident that Fort Wayne, the city of Fort Wayne, will not have a flooding issue also. So that should occur in 2014. So the fence will be replaced by a massive dike system that will handle a 1,000-year flood.
Any other questions? Anybody? Yes? You want to?
Wait, hang on. We're recording, so that's why we want to get a microphone to you.
I'm sorry, I don't know if this is really a question, but in reality, it sounds like the biggest problem is with the weather change, it's the runoff problem, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about the ice covering and the change of climate, but really that all just causes more storms, more rain, more runoff, and the algae bloom seems to be the problem. Is that kind of what I'm getting out of the discussion?
From a lake,
something?
yeah, primarily from a Lake Erie standpoint, definitely, and from places like Traverse Bay, Green Bay, Saginaw Bay, where you've got a little bit shallower, warmer water. The same situation occurs there too. The algae situation is reaching critical point, when it starts to affect public water. Lake Erie supplies drinking water to 11 million people. 11 million. So if there's a major issue out there, if the algae switches over and you've got toxins to deal with that overwhelms the water treatment facilities, there's going to be, as they say, hell to pay. We should not get to that point. But yeah, runoff is a really, really big issue. And going back to your question, one of the big issues that's going on out there, and one of the major recommendations that is coming out, is to recommend that fertilizers and manures are not applied to frozen or snow-covered ground. It really doesn't do much good to do that when you have a spring rain that comes along with 4 or 5 inches of rainfall and immediately flushes it out through the tiles, into the ditches, and out the rivers into the lake. So those practices right there would go a long, long way to stop it. Even if we did continue to have massive rain events, if it's not there to flush out, you've gained some ground right away. What's great about Lake Erie, because it's so shallow, that it flushes itself out the western basin in under 60 days. The whole lake will flush itself out in 2 years, compared to 100 years for Lake Superior. So it'll clean itself up. It did once before. We did it once before. And one more thing to yours there. I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away here, but monitoring. Today we don't have enough monitoring to tell us, of all these programs that we've talked about, is it really doing any good? Back when the lake was dead before, there were monitors all over the lake, and that's how points were, the point sources and all that were pinpointed out there to where the problem areas were. When the lake cleaned up back in the 1990s, 95, it was beautiful out there. No longer was the need seen to have the monitors and to keep them going, so of course the funding was cut off, and there were no monitors left out there. Today there aren't any monitors out there, but we do have programs going on this year that are replacing some of them. It takes a lot of money to have a continuous operating monitor going on, but at least we're getting to the point where we actually have some out there, so now we can look at the farming practices and does this work, does it not work, is this one a better one, where's a tributary that's really adding to the phosphorus. So there's some positive things going on to try to remedy the situation.
Yeah, and I think, Dave, you nailed it. I would add that, I guess the theme taken away from this is that there's all sorts of factors that are impacting fish right now. The overriding factor that's going to really push to a tipping point is climate change. It's so unpredictable. But there are, in our opinion, there are 2 solutions that I think that we could throw out there as helping the Great Lakes become more resilient, helping the fish become more resilient. And that's a highly successful program called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It was originally created by George Bush, called together all the scientists to figure out what do the Great Lakes need and how much would it cost to fix them. They got a collaboration together, and now President Obama every year has funded it and Congress has appropriated it. So over 4 years, we're facing new dollars coming to the Great Lakes, $1.3 billion that goes towards restoration projects that get at some of these issues we talked about today. So I would argue that that is one of our greatest climate adaptation strategies to help get at some of these issues we talked about. The number two solution I think we can work out is what we call the Great Lakes Compact. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but there was a threat of diversions of water from places across the country, even internationally. We had a tanker that a permit was approved by Canada to take Lake Huron water to Asia for bottled water resorts. It was just approved without any U.S. input. That threw everyone into this hysteria of we need to protect our water. So now we have a prohibition on diversions of water, and also have a system in place that manages our water levels, promotes conservation so that we can sustain our water levels. To me, that is a climate adaptation tool that we really need to use and recognize as a way when we're making decisions, whether it's on fish or wetlands or on toxics or invasive species, let's start thinking in how can we use the Great Lakes Compact as an adaptation tool. The third thing, obviously, is, well, let's protect. Let's stop putting the carbon emissions into our atmosphere that's causing the problem to begin with. So we can get into a whole host of things of what we can do to help reduce power plant emissions. But, you know, and that's a legislative fight, and that we can get, EPA is making some strides to actually put on some restrictions on coal-fired power plants. You know, we know that if you set a standard on, and regulate an industry and allow the technology to catch up to it, that's the only carrot and incentive that has worked. We've seen it with the automobile industry, with fuel efficiency standards. We've seen it with, that's what we're doing with ballast water now. You know, set a standard that industry has to figure out a way to meet. And we're learning from the fuel efficiency fights we had in the 90s with the automobile industry that it worked. Now the automobile industry is actually touting fuel efficiency. Same can be said with how we approach our energy sources, and you know, put regulations on them so that we can have tougher standards and allow industry to figure out a way to meet them. Those three things are the biggest things that we can do. There are no easy challenges, but we're already seeing success. I said $1.3 billion new money. The last thing I want to say, I don't want to take any more time, but you know, all of this talk about the government shutdown and lack of bipartisan work together. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is an example where Republicans and Democrats have actually worked together. The example I'm going to bring up is $475 million the first year Congress appropriated for this, $300 million the next, $300 the second year. Last year was $280. Again, Congress, President appropriated in his budget $300 million for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Congress in the House slashed it by 80% down to $60 million. 2 days later, Republicans and Democrats got an amendment to restore it to full funding. And that's a sign, that's a unique situation. Tell me another story where you see these guys working together to provide money. And so that's a benefit that we have here. So let's use that momentum to fight some of these problems and work together to find these solutions.
Okay, question here.
This is a question about an educational issue. What happened to living on Earth, and can we get it back on W of M?
I'll talk to you later. Steve knows more about that than I do, but yeah, it's a programming decision that is out of my control. But we can talk.
Other questions?
Yeah, fish questions, climate questions, lakes.
I don't know if this is a climate question, but what effect does all the dredging on the St. Clair River have?
Well, so there are a lot of species that we didn't even know spawn in the St. Clair and the Detroit River that actually use that river for spawning habitat. It traditionally, or historically, before the channel was widened and dredged in 1920, there were huge lake whitefish fisheries which depended on the spawning habitat in that river. Walleyes use that habitat. Through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, they've just been restoring spawning habitat for lake sturgeon, walleyes, and as soon as they put the rocks down on the ground, there was lake sturgeon there spawning on them. In fact, they had a scuba diver down there taking video of it, and he got covered with lake sturgeon eggs. So it's really valuable habitat. So anything that you do to kind of remove some of that habitat is going to be an issue. But it's efforts like that to restore habitat for these sensitive life stages that are going to help.
I'm not thinking so much of habitat, but isn't that like pulling the cork out of the tub and let the water drain down?
Yeah, there was a study done by National Commission, several scientists looking at Great Lakes water levels to address that very question, because people in Georgian Bay were really upset their lake levels were going down, and they thought it was due to further digging that canal or that channel in the St. Clair. And as far as I understand it, they didn't think it was that was the cause of the lake level drop. They attributed it to climate change.
Yes, I'll have Steve bring the mic over.
You touched earlier on temperature stratification in the lakes. Isn't there a seasonal flip where the cold water comes to the surface and circulates nutrients, and is that being impacted by climate change?
Yes, it is, and you're right, it does. There is a natural cycle of spring and fall when the lakes are really well mixed, and that helps bring the nutrients up and makes it more available to plants and zooplankton and up in the water column. And under increased warming, that stratification where you don't have mixing between bottom waters and surface waters, that will prevent that mixing process. So it also helps bring up oxygen from bottom waters to surface waters. So overall, it limits oxygen and nutrients. I just wanted to comment, there actually are several resource agencies out there, state and provincial and federal, I'm speaking as a private citizen now, that have been monitoring the Great Lakes since the 1970s with the establishment of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and Clean Water Act. And it was due to those monitoring programs that we started noticing the phosphorus levels going back up in Lake Erie, which led, and then we noticed these invasive species coming in. So for sure we need more effort, we need more support for those programs, I think, but there are people out there looking at it. I'm not one of them, but I know there are.
All right, I'm getting the signal to wrap up, so I think that must be our last question. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'd like to thank Consumers Mutual Insurance of Michigan for their financial support of our Issues and Ale events, Marc Ridley's Comedy Castle for hosting our event tonight, and also the Great Lakes Fishery Trust for their support of our In Warm Water Fish in the Changing Great Lakes series. Let's thank our panelists. And thank you all very much.